The rain came down in sheets that morning, turning the city skyline into a blur of gray glass and headlights. Jane Walters, 42, sat at her desk in the corner of the open-plan operations floor, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Her inbox was glowing red with unread emails, but her eyes weren't on the screen. They were fixed on the clock, 50 a.m. 3 minutes until the meeting that would decide her next 5 years. The past month had been brutal. 12-hour days, missed dinners, and the same dull ache behind her eyes that refused to leave. Still, she'd been hopeful. She'd led the entire transition project that saved the company nearly $500,000. She'd trained the new hires, rewritten the outdated manuals, and even stayed over one weekend. When the system crashed, everyone told her this was her moment. Then, just as she was about to grab her notepad, Richard Wells, director of operations, appeared in her doorway, his tie slightly crooked, his smile tight. "Jane, let's keep this short," he said, gesturing toward the conference room. Her stomach tightened. Inside, the blinds were drawn halfway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. HR was there, always a bad sign, and the smell of burnt coffee clung to the air. Richard sat across from her, flipping through her performance review as if it were a grocery list. "You've done excellent work this quarter," he began, in that careful tone managers use when they're about to deliver bad news. "The logistics overhaul, the client retention improvements, it's all been noticed." Jane smiled slightly, cautious but hopeful. "Thank you, Richard. I've put a lot into. However," he set the folder down, "the executive team feels you're not quite ready for the senior manager role." Her throat tightened. "Not ready? I've been doing the senior manager's workload for almost a year." He nodded, sympathetically, fake sympathy. "Yes, and we appreciate that initiative. But the feedback we've received is that you need to demonstrate stronger leadership presence. You're very good operationally, almost too good, but leadership requires visibility, influence." "Visibility," she repeated. "You mean talking more in meetings?" Richard smiled like she'd caught on. "Exactly. You're reliable, Jane. You make things run. But leadership is about being seen as the one driving the vision. Don't take it personally. It's a development opportunity." Development opportunity. That phrase always made her blood simmer. She'd heard it used on women a dozen times before, always as a polite way to say you're indispensable, but not promotable. Jane felt the room spin slightly as he continued talking, something about next quarter, evaluations and mentorship opportunities. She didn't remember much after that. She nodded, thanked him, shook HR's hand, and walked out. Back at her desk, the team was watching her closely. "Well?" her coworker Sam asked quietly. Jane forced a smile. "Not this time," he frowned. "You're kidding. After that project, you carried the department." She shrugged. "Apparently I'm too invisible." He muttered something under his breath, but Jane didn't hear it. Her hands were shaking slightly as she sat down. The glow of her monitor felt harsher than usual, the buzz of the office suddenly unbearable. She opened a spreadsheet, but the numbers blurred. 8 years of being reliable, 8 years of staying late, fixing mistakes others made, carrying silent chaos on her shoulders. For what? A polite pat on the back and a promise to revisit in 6 months? That was the moment something inside her went quiet. The part that always said, "Work harder. They'll notice." Instead, another voice rose, quieter, sharper. "Stop giving them everything." That night, for the first time in months, she left at 5. No extra reports, no weekend prep, no cleaning up behind others. She cooked dinner, watched an old movie, slept through the night. It was small, almost invisible, but it was a rebellion. 2 days later, her phone lit up with 19 missed calls, then 23, and that's when Jane knew something had gone very, very wrong at Pinnacle. Systems the ringtone sliced through the hum of the morning traffic. Jane's phone vibrated on the passenger seat as she drove toward the office, one hand on the wheel, one balancing a lukewarm cup of coffee. She glanced down. "Sam. 3 missed calls. Richard. Missed calls. Our voicemail." Her stomach tightened. The clock on the dashboard read 8:12 a.m. She was 15 minutes away from the office, but part of her didn't want to go. At the next red light, she opened one of the voicemails. Richard's voice was unsteady, clipped. "Jane, call me back immediately. There's been a situation in logistics. The shipment data's gone. Entire system's down. We can't trace the audit trail. I need you in here now. Her heart skipped. The shipment data system, her system, was the backbone of operations. But since she'd stopped babysitting it, no one else had touched the backup scripts she'd created. She exhaled, eyes on the traffic light turning green. Of course something broke. Of course, the moment she stopped patching holes, the whole ship started sinking. By the time she reached Pinnacle Systems, the building buzzed with chaos. The usually composed operations floor looked like a war zone. People were pacing, printers jammed, phones ringing nonstop. Sam met her at the door, wide-eyed and pale. "Jane!" "Thank God. We can't access the shipment logs for the Singapore and Dubai routes. The database corrupted overnight. I'd saying we lost everything past last Thursday." Jane blinked. "What about the backups?" "Apparently no one's been running them since..." His voice trailed off as realization hit both of them. "Since you stopped." She stared at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You're saying the backup scheduler hasn't been automated?" "I sent a full procedure for that 6 months ago." Sam rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, but Richard said it was too technical. He told me you'd handle it." Jane let out a slow breath, her mind already reconstructing the timeline. 8 years of building redundancy into every process. And yet the moment she stopped doing it herself, the system crumbled. Inside Richard's glass-walled office, he was pacing like a trapped animal when he saw her. His face lit up with a mix of panic and relief. "Jane, thank God you're here." She closed the door quietly behind her. "What happened?" "The audit database crashed. The vendors are calling nonstop. We can't trace inventory for half our outgoing shipments. The CEO's demanding answers in an hour." He ran a hand through his hair. "You built that process. You know it inside out. Please, tell me you can fix it." Jane studied him for a long moment. The same man who told her she wasn't ready for promotion, now standing in front of her, begging for rescue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She just said evenly, "You said you wanted me to focus on leadership visibility, remember? So I stopped micromanaging operations. I assumed someone else was handling it." Richard froze, blinking. "Jane, this isn't the time." "No." "Richard, it's exactly the time." Her tone was calm, controlled. Years of swallowed frustration surfacing as clarity, not anger. "You wanted me to be seen, not do. Well, this is what happens when the people who actually make things work stop doing." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jane looked at the frozen monitors on his desk. Rows of corrupted data, shipment numbers scrambled into nonsense. She could fix it. It would take her maybe 3 hours. 4 at most. But she didn't move. Instead, she asked, "Who's leading the crisis team?" Richard hesitated. "Technically you." "No, Richard. I was told I wasn't ready for leadership." She gave a faint smile. "So maybe someone who is ready should handle it." For the first time in 8 years, she watched him sweat. He ran a hand across his forehead. "Jane, please. You know this isn't about..." "Of course it is." She turned toward the glass wall, where her co-workers were watching through the blinds, confused and anxious. "You've built a system that only runs because a few of us give more than we're paid for. And when we stop, it collapses. That's not leadership. That's dependency." Richard swallowed hard. "Are you saying you won't help?" "I'm saying I've done my job," she said quietly. "If you want me to fix what's broken, we can discuss that as peers." For a moment, silence. The hum of the office beyond the glass. Then he said, almost whispering, "Fine, we'll talk about it. Just please fix it." She nodded once, picked up her bag and walked toward her workstation. That day, Jane didn't just fix the system, she rebuilt it, documented every procedure, and trained the team, all while keeping Richard out of the loop. By 4 p.m., shipments were back online, the vendors pacified, and the CEO's tone had shifted from fury to faint praise. But when she looked at her reflection in the darkened monitor that evening, she didn't feel relief, she felt clarity, because for the first time, she understood. She'd been keeping the company alive at the expense of herself, and that was about to change. Before I continue, from which place are you watching this story right now? Please subscribe and like the video for motivation. The next morning, Jane arrived at the office earlier than usual, not out of guilt or panic, but with purpose. The sky outside was still a pale gray, the city just waking up. She set her coffee on the desk, opened her laptop and started typing, not code, Not reports, but documentation. Every process she had ever created, every workflow, every emergency protocol, every workaround the company ran on, but no one ever credited her for. Line by line, she built a record of her invisible labor. She titled the document simply, Operational Continuity, authored by J. Walters. For years, she'd been the person who filled in the gaps, doing 10 different jobs that weren't in her title because it helped the team. She realized now that she'd been quietly carrying the entire structure, like beams hidden behind a polished wall. Now she was exposing the framework, not to help them, but to prove her worth could be measured. By 9:30 a.m., the office was buzzing again. People nodded politely as they passed, unaware that she was building something far more powerful than another backup system. Sam leaned on her cubicle wall. "You're in early. I figured after yesterday you'd take a day off." Jane smiled faintly. "Not yet. I'm cleaning house." He frowned. "Cleaning what?" "Processes," she said. "I'm making sure if I disappeared tomorrow, everything I do can run without me." He blinked. "That sounds dangerous." "Exactly." Later that afternoon, Richard called her into his office again. This time his tone was softer, almost rehearsed. "Jane," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "I wanted to personally thank you for how you handled yesterday. The CEO was impressed with your composure under pressure. He mentioned we might revisit your development plan sooner than expected." Jane raised an eyebrow. "Revisit? That's a nice word for stall." He smiled tightly. "We just need to see a bit more visibility." She finished for him, voice calm but firm. "You've used that word a lot lately." Richard paused. "Well, yes. Leadership visibility." She studied him quietly. "Out of curiosity, did you tell the CEO that the database crash happened because you ignored the automation procedures I sent months ago?" He blinked, his expression faltering. It wasn't the right time to—" Jane nodded, as if she already knew. "Of course not. You needed someone to fix it first." The air between them went still. "Richard," she said finally, "do you know how many of your so-called leaders wouldn't last a week without the people who actually do the work?" He didn't answer. She continued, voice steady. "I'm done being invisible. I'm documenting everything. Every policy, every shortcut, every system I built. I'll send you a copy when it's done." Richard frowned. "That's not standard protocol." "It's my protocol now," she interrupted, standing. "Because when I walk out of this company, I want you to know exactly what collapses behind me." For a brief second, something in his expression flickered. Fear, maybe, or realization. Jane gave him a polite smile. "You should probably start thinking about your backup plan too." Then she walked out, heels clicking on the polished floor. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and only the glow of her monitor remained, Jane uploaded the finished file to a secure drive. Then she printed one copy, neatly bound, labeled, and sealed. She placed it in an envelope and wrote, in calm blue ink, "In case of my absence." When she left the building, she didn't look back. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking home tired. She was walking home free. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, stirring her tea as the city lights blinked outside. Jake's photo, her teenage son, smiled from the fridge door. She thought of all the nights she'd missed when he was younger, working late to prove herself, to people who'd never see her worth. Never. Again, she picked up her phone and opened her email drafts. The subject line read, "Resignation effective immediately." Her finger hovered over send. Not yet, she thought. Not until they truly understand what happens when she's gone. The quiet rebellion wasn't over. It was just beginning. Monday morning, the energy inside Pinnacle Systems felt off. It wasn't chaos yet. More like the uneasy silence before a storm. Jane walked through the glass doors with her usual calm. Her ID badge beeped green, but the security guard gave her a sympathetic look. Everyone had heard whispers about the logistics crash, and most knew who had saved them. As she made her way to her desk, she noticed it, the small signs of unraveling, a shipment delay, email.a meeting, cancellation. A customer escalation marked urgent. The wheels of the company were wobbling. Not broken, but clearly off balance. She sat down, logged in, and watched. She didn't intervene for years. She'd been the invisible glue holding everything together. Now she was letting it show what happened when the glue stopped sticking. By mid-morning, Sam appeared at her cubicle. Panic written all over his face. Jane, have you seen this? He handed her a printed email chain, upper management. Frantic, copying half the department. The vendor audit team had found massive discrepancies in the supply logs. No one knew where the missing units went. She glanced at it, her face unreadable. They didn't use the verification module, did they? Sam shook his head. Apparently, it got disabled during the update last week. IT says it wasn't in their scope. Jane sighed softly. Because they never read the documentation. Should I tell them? She looked up at him, calm but firm. No, let them find it. That's what visibility looks like. He blinked. You're serious? Completely. Her tone wasn't bitter. It was surgical, detached. Every time I fix something quietly, someone else takes credit. Maybe it's time they take credit for the failures, too. Sam hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. You're right. By noon, the office atmosphere had turned thick. Phones ringing. Managers darting from cubicle to cubicle. People whispering in clusters. The project timelines were slipping. Vendors were threatening penalties. From her seat, Jane could see Richard in his glass office, his tie loosened. His jaw clenched as he gestured at someone on the phone. He looked smaller somehow, every few minutes. His eyes flicked toward her desk, searching, waiting. But Jane didn't move. She worked only on her assigned tasks. No more extra spreadsheets, no weekend prep, no safety net. It was astonishing how quickly the cracks widened. Without her invisible effort holding things up, by 3 p.m., the inevitable happened. Department-wide meeting request from Richard. Mandatory operational review. Popped up on everyone's calendar. In the conference room, tension hung thick as humidity. Jane sat quietly at the end of the table, her notebook closed. Richard paced at the front. Exhaustion etched across his face. All right, he began, forcing authority into his voice. We've had a few setbacks. Nothing catastrophic, but we need to tighten coordination. There's been some process miscommunication. Miscommunication, Jane said evenly. You mean failure to follow documented procedure? Richard froze. Jane, this isn't about blame. It's about accountability, she corrected. And you know what's interesting? Every process that failed this week was one I used to handle personally. The room went silent. Someone from HR shifted awkwardly in their seat. Richard exhaled. Look, we all depend on your systems, Jane. No one's denying your value. But you need to understand. I understand perfectly, she interrupted, voice calm but cutting. You promoted visibility over reliability. You wanted me to step back from the details. I did exactly that. And the moment I did, the foundation started cracking. Her words landed like glass breaking. He tried to salvage control. That's not fair. Leadership means delegation and accountability, she finished, which is why I documented every process, every instruction, and every ignored recommendation. If you'd like, I can send it all to the executive board so they can see exactly where the breakdown started. Few people in the room exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even HR looked uneasy. Richard's face flushed. Jane, she stood up slowly, closing her notebook. You said I wasn't ready for leadership. But tell me, Richard, what do leaders do when their system fails? Do they look for someone to blame, or do they take responsibility? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Jane gave a polite nod to the room. Then maybe you're the one who isn't ready. And with that, she walked out. That night, she received an email from the CEO's assistant. Subject, meeting request, executive review with CEO, Tuesday 9 a.m., no explanation. No context. Just that. Jane stared at the screen, feeling the quiet satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. The dominoes were falling, not out of revenge, but gravity. She had simply stepped away, and the truth revealed itself. Tomorrow, the real reckoning would begin. The elevator hummed as it climbed, floor after floor, the numbers glowing softly in the mirrored panel. Jane stood still, hands folded around a thin folder of her documentation. Neat, precise, labeled. Her reflection looked calm, almost detached. But her pulse drummed beneath her skin when the doors slid open on the 24th floor. The air itself felt different, quieter, colder, expensive. The reception desk gleamed, and beyond it, the glass doors etched with silver letters. CEO, Martin Hale. She'd only been up here twice in 8 years. Both times had been for presentations where Richard had spoken over her slides. Now, She was here alone. At the CEO's request, Martin Hale was in his late 50s, composed, a man who'd learned to weaponize stillness. He gestured for her to sit. "Jane Walters," he said. "You've had quite a week." "Yes," she replied evenly. "So I've heard." He smiled slightly. "I'll get straight to it. I've reviewed the incident reports. Every failure in operations traces back to ignored procedures, all of which, apparently you created." Jane nodded once. "That's correct. Richard tells me you've been withholding support since last Thursday." She met his gaze. "I've been performing my assigned role. Nothing more, nothing less." He leaned back, studying her. "You've built a remarkable system here. The company depends on it more than I realized. But dependence can be dangerous. For both sides." "I agree," she said quietly. "Which is why I've documented everything. So there's no dependence, only accountability." He regarded her for a long moment. "You think you've been treated unfairly?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." Martin opened one of the printed reports. "You've been here 8 years. Every measurable metric shows consistent overperformance. Yet your salary's below the departmental median. And you've never been promoted." He closed the file. "Why didn't you bring this up sooner?" Jane's answer was soft but steady. "Because for a long time, I believed the story they told us, that if you work hard enough, you'll be seen. But visibility here doesn't come from work. It comes from proximity." The words hung in the air. Calm, factual, lethal. The CEO folded his hands. "Richard's record shows that he recommended you for development. He claims leadership presence was the concern." Jane tilted her head. "If leadership means preventing collapse while others take credit, I've been leading for years." Silence. Then slowly he nodded. "Point taken." He stood and walked toward the window, looking down at the city below. "I can't undo the culture overnight, but I can correct one thing immediately." He turned. "I want you to head operations officially, title, salary, full authority. You'll report directly to me." For a heartbeat, Jane said nothing. Her mind flashed through 8 years of late nights, quiet fixes, invisible effort, all the unspoken gratitude that never came. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured. "That's generous. But I need to be clear about something." He raised an eyebrow. "Go on. I'll accept only if it comes with structural change, transparency, credit where it's due, and documented processes that outlast personalities. Otherwise, this place will eat another person alive. Just like it almost did me." Martin studied her for a long time, then smiled, a real one this time. "You drive a hard bargain, Ms. Walters." "I've spent 8 years driving a broken one," she said. "I think I've earned a new model." He chuckled softly. "Consider it done." When she left the office, the elevator ride down felt different, lighter. She wasn't thinking about victory. She was thinking about balance. She'd fought not for revenge, but for respect. And finally, it had arrived on her own terms. As she stepped out onto the street, the city air hit her face, crisp, alive. Her phone buzzed. A message from Sam. "Sam, heard about the meeting. Is it true? You're the new director?" Jane smiled faintly and typed back, "Jane, it's true. But the real work starts now." That evening, she walked past her old reflection in the office windows, and the one who'd stayed late, chasing approval. That woman was gone. Now, she was something else. Entirely visible. The new nameplate outside her glass-walled office still felt foreign. Jane Walters, Director of Operations. It gleamed in the morning light, a quiet testament to the war. She'd won without raising her voice, but victory, she realized, wasn't rest. It was responsibility, heavier than before, sharper at the edges. Inside, the department buzzed differently. Now, people greeted her with careful smiles, respect mixed with curiosity, even fear. Richard's old corner desk was empty. Rumor said he'd been reassigned. Jane hadn't asked where. She didn't need to. She spent her first week not giving orders, but listening. Every report, every bottleneck, every tired face that had been overlooked. At one meeting, a junior analyst, nervous, barely 24, stammered through a suggestion. Jane leaned forward. "Pen still." "Say that again," she said softly. He repeated it, slower this time. "It was brilliant, simple, efficient." She nodded. "Let's test it, and make sure your name's on the proposal." A few heads turned. It was a small thing, but in that moment, she could almost feel the Air shift. An invisible permission had been granted. Late one night, the office empty. Jane stood by the window again. Same view. Different altitude. The city glittered below. Indifferent yet alive. Sam's reflection appeared behind her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He'd stayed late again, helping her clean up the operational mess Richard had left behind. Feels strange, doesn't it? He said. Jane smiled faintly. What does? Being in charge. She turned, taking the mug. It doesn't feel like being in charge, she said. It feels like holding a mirror to everything that broke and deciding what's worth fixing, Sam chuckled. You're too poetic for a director. Maybe, she said. But someone has to rewrite the story. The next morning, Richard showed up. He stood by her door, hesitating before knocking. His once slick confidence had dulled. The corners of his smile didn't reach his eyes. Jane, he said softly. Got a minute? She looked up from her desk, calm, unreadable. Sure, Richard. Come in. He stepped in, hands in pockets, scanning the office that used to be his domain. Looks good in here, he said. You did it. I did my job, she corrected. He nodded, eyes flicking to the window. I wanted to say, I didn't expect things to turn out like this. Jane set her pen down. Didn't you? He swallowed, the silence stretching. I made mistakes. I know that now. Maybe I didn't give credit where it was due. But you've got to admit, you were always intense. Her expression didn't change. I was consistent. There's a difference. He nodded again, avoiding her gaze. Anyway, congratulations. As he turned to leave, Jane spoke, her tone even, but cutting through the room like glass. Richard, he stopped. For what it's worth. I don't need an apology, she said, but I hope the next time you see someone doing invisible work, you remember this. He looked back at her, eyes flickering between pride, shame, and something like regret. Then he nodded once and walked out. The door clicked shut, leaving only quiet, the kind that feels earned. Later that evening, Jane walked the floor one last time before heading out. She passed desks where laughter had replaced tension, where people collaborated instead of competing. The walls didn't hum with fear anymore. They hummed with movement. As she reached the elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished steel. The same face, the same calm, but behind it, something had changed, not power, presence. That night, she didn't dream about failure or survival. She dreamed about building something stable, something that would stand long after she was gone. And when she woke before dawn, her phone buzzed again. Message from Martin Hale. Martin, board meeting next week. I'd like you to present the new operations model. Also, there's talk of expanding you to regional oversight. Think about it. Jane smiled to herself in the dark. Once, she'd been invisible in that very building. Now, she was rewriting its blueprint. The boardroom at Pinnacle Systems had always intimidated her. Once floor-to-ceiling windows, a table long enough to seat 20 people, polished so bright you could see your own reflection. She used to sit near the end, taking notes, waiting for someone to ask her, opinion and pretending. She didn't care when they never did, but that morning, when Jane walked in, the energy was different. Executives murmured quietly. Slides were ready on the screen, and Martin Hale, the CEO, nodded toward the head chair. Her chair. Jane, he said, his voice carrying a kind of respect that wasn't performative. You're leading this one. She took her seat, calm and precise as the skyline glowed behind her. No nerves, no second guessing, just clarity. She started her presentation without flourish. 8 months ago, she said, this company was running on good intentions and broken systems. We relied on heroics instead of structure, and on people doing extra work for no recognition. That's not sustainability. That's survival. She clicked the first slide, a web of red lines, showing bottlenecks, missed handoffs, and communication failures. Then another, clean, organized, blue lines now, connecting every department. I didn't fix this alone, she continued. I fixed it because the people who'd been ignored finally had a voice. All I did was make sure the system could hear them. The room went silent, not in discomfort, but in realization. These weren't numbers. They were the truth behind every late night, every ignored email, every small, unpaid victory that had kept the company alive. Martin leaned forward, thoughtful. So where do you see us going from here? Jane smiled faintly. Upward, but not at the cost of burning out the ones who build the foundation. You can't grow a company by breaking the people who hold it. Together, after the meeting, as everyone filed out, Martin lingered. You know, he said. Richard didn't understand what he had. But I do, he paused. If you ever want to move beyond operations, say regional leadership or even executive. Jane stopped him gently. I appreciate that. But I'm not chasing titles anymore, he smiled. Then what are you chasing? She looked out the window. At the city that had once dwarfed her, balance, she said, and building things that last. That evening, the office was quiet again. That same stillness she'd once found suffocating. Now peaceful, she gathered her things and looked around one last time. At the desks where people now laughed, collaborated, trusted. Her gaze landed on her old cubicle, smaller, tucked away, still holding a faint trace of her first years here. Memory flashed. The tired woman who once stayed late, waiting for validation that never came. Jane smiled softly. She didn't need their approval anymore. She'd built her own outside. The rain began again, light and rhythmic against the glass doors, just like that. Night months ago when everything began to fall apart, but now it didn't sound heavy, it sounded like renewal. Jane stepped into the rain, without her umbrella, head high the city lights, reflecting off every drop like silver sparks. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another congratulatory message from a senior VP she barely knew. She didn't look at it. Instead, she walked toward the parking garage, her pace slow, deliberate, each step echoing the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Steady. Sure, when she reached her car, she paused, watching the reflection of the towering pinnacle building behind her. The lights inside formed a faint W shape, like a quiet symbol of win. She whispered, almost to herself, "You said I wasn't ready, Richard. Turns out I was just done waiting for permission." She got into her car, started the engine, and drove off, not toward another late night at work, but toward her son's school recital she'd promised to attend, and this time, she'd be there early.